All right, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. The end of the year is quickly approaching, so now it's the time to get ready for CECL. So before we begin, we are in presentation mode, so you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. If you do have questions, please click on the question icon on your screen. I'll answer those towards the end of the webinar, if not during. But you will also receive an email with the slides from the webinar, along with a link to the recording on our YouTube channel. So without further ado, jump in here. My name is Jason Heinrich. I've been working with credit unions for over 12 years on both the customer service and sales side. And we also have Steve Huntington, Director of Analytics here, has been the creator of our CECLSolver tool. So perfect guy to have on the call today. But let's jump in, talk about CECL. So first thing we always get here is what was wrong with the incurred loss model, right? It's one of the comments we hear on our demos most is, what was wrong with the current incurred loss model? Well, why the change? Well, this all goes back to the last crisis, and in FASB's opinion, they felt the incurred loss model did a disservice to financial institutions by allowing them to not acknowledge losses until they were probable. So that approach used to recognize impairment losses on financial assets had long been identified as a major weakness, resulting in delayed recognition of those losses. So at this point, FASB had a couple options, right? Fix the methodology or do nothing. And if you do nothing and the problem reoccurs, well, then you expose yourself to people asking, hey, why did you do anything to fix it? So clearly, FASB decided that was not what they're going to be, what their solution was going to be, so they decided to fix it. And CECL is that fix. So unfortunately for us, it means learning a new way to calculate your reserve. But at the end of the day, we're just calculating the reserve, right? We like to say here, we're playing the same game just with a new set of rules. So we're still going to focus on reserves. We're just going to go about it in a slightly different manner. So let's talk about those changes. So, I think you'll see here that there are a number of areas where CECL and a CECLSolver can feel very similar to to how things have been done in the past with the incurred loss methodology. And really, one of the reasons why we like the WAR methodology is its similarities to the incurred loss model. So first, CECL will be different in that we will be looking at losses over a longer life of the loan approach instead of looking at losses over maybe an annual or a couple-year look back that most institutions do now with their ALLL. But now you want to make allowance for all losses over the life of the loan or loan pool. But there are some similarities as well. We're still going to pool assets, make Q factor adjustments, and make assumptions to justify those Q factors. So, we're going to build on some of the similarities, make a few slight changes along the way. Now, really, what does this mean for you? Well, first, there is no one mandatory method for calculating your reserve under CECL. The NCUA has mentioned several different methodologies like the WAR method, but the choice is completely up to you. You choose your path, and you will have to defend this to your examiner and absolutely understand where your final reserve number is coming from and document that appropriately. And this will be the case for any tool or partner you choose. The NCUA has also stated that your chosen reserve methodology matches the complexity of your portfolio. For most traditional credit unions under a few billion asset size, a call report driven analysis using the WAR method will be perfectly acceptable. You do not need to engage in highly complex modeling or loan level analysis. So current expected credit loss here when it comes to implementing CECL, there are some practical considerations. First is, how much data have you collected? Do you have detailed loan level data going back at least 5 years? To do a more complex loan level analysis, you'll need to have this data collected and reconciled before even starting your first actual reserve calculation. And in our experience, that process can take a couple of years. So for the other warm options, what is the actual cost? I've seen some Excel-based models out there, but that are free. But how much work do you think you'll have to allocate to calculating a reserve? That free option might not cost money, but tends to be very expensive when it comes to your time. Also, how about data from outside the credit union? What have the loss trends been in your state? How do your losses compare? Having good internal data is obviously important, but having comparable peer data will be very helpful, especially in areas where you have little to no losses. So, that peer data can help establish reasonable and supportable CECL reserves and further support your assumptions and reserve figures. But in the end, we feel that CECLSolver hits that perfect balance of simplicity and automation while still giving you the ability to add complexity where needed. So that brings us to why we introduced the CECLSolver. In the very beginning, when we saw the original guidance for CECL, that guidance was really for more complex, massive institutions, and we knew that would not work for most credit unions. So we set out to create a CECL tool that was easy to use, collected the relevant data for you, and to really honestly create a CECL tool that was just easy to understand and follow. We also wanted to create a CECL solution that was really quick to implement and easy to maintain from month to month, quarter to quarter. And I feel we have done exactly that with our CECLSolver tool for credit unions, which brings us to the live demo. And I'm going to pass that over to Steve. Give me 1 second here.
Thank you, Jason.
Absolutely. All right, pass it over.
Right. Yep, give me just a second. Bear with me while I get my screen shared. Let me know when that pops up for you.
I can see it.
Excellent. Again, thanks. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this afternoon so we can sort of walk through our CECLSolver solution. What I'm showing you right now is exactly what you would see the first time that you logged into our CECLSolver tool. Obviously, I'm using a guinea pig for today. It's a larger credit union in Wisconsin, and they happen to have a lot of loan level or a lot of loan data at all different segmentation throughout the portfolio. So there are not a ton of zeros on there, which makes it a little bit easier for us to kind of walk through and follow the math. So we'll use them for illustrative purposes today. But the first thing that you'll notice when you pull up our CECL tool is that we begin with the segmentation that's available to us through the updated call reports. And the reason we do that is because it allows us to get long-term historical balance, charge-off, and recovery data by segment going all the way back as far as we need to from a CECL perspective, which obviously from a time-saving perspective is huge because we're able to kind of, as a starting point, the second you log in, you can already look at that historical data trend without spending a lot of time reconciling accounts from one bucket to another. And even more importantly than the time saving factor is that it allows us to look outside your four walls to the environment around you in an apples to apples sort of way. As Jason already sort of alluded to, I'm sure most of you on the call today probably have one, if not more, if not most segments of your portfolio right now performing pretty admirably, right? We've been in a relatively benign asset quality environment for a pretty extended period now. And just because you haven't had any losses in your mortgage portfolio over the last 7 years does not mean that you're going to be able to say under CECL that you don't need to keep a reserve for your mortgage loans because you haven't seen any losses there in almost a decade. Which is pretty obvious, but the challenge that creates is how are we to justify the reserve level we have for segments of our portfolio where we simply haven't seen any loss over any reasonable look back period? And the answer is in the ability to look at that loan data outside of your credit union, in your peer groups and in the environment around you. So the benefit of this tool and the way it's designed is we don't just look at your mortgage loans or used vehicle loans and capture that long-term trend. We look at every single used vehicle loan in your peer group. So in your around with similar size credit unions in your state or your region or around the country. And we analyze the performance of all of those loans so that you can say, even though we've had 0 losses on our used vehicle loans over the last 4 years, we know that there are some losses around us in the environment. For example, our peers tend to have about 15, 20 basis points a year. So it allows you, it gives you some more good justification to, or kind of build that narrative as to why you have the reserve levels you do for certain segments of the portfolio. But let me take a step back and just kind of walk through how the tool works. Since we're heavily utilizing the weighted average remaining maturity method, or the warm method for short, which is certainly one of the more straightforward approaches that's been vetted and approved for CECL compliance for most typical credit unions. The first step is getting a handle on the average remaining lives of the loans that we have on the books right now. And that's not a calculation that's specific to the warm method. You really can't get around, no matter what methodology you use for CECL, since CECL at its heart is all about estimating losses over the remaining lives of the assets. We have to get a feel for what those remaining lives on a pool basis are. Of course, that's not data that's available to us publicly from the call reports. Nowhere on there does it ask you guys to do weighted average remaining maturity calculation. And so we have lots of ways to work with you to do those calculations on the front end of our tool. The first, obviously, the easiest way is if that's something that your core or ALM provider can provide you in a report. Sometimes they have those types of reports ready, depending upon who you work with, but a lot of times they don't. It's not something we really hold our breath for. If that's the case, and it typically is, then you will be calculating your WARMs internally with our assistance, or you can hand off the entire process to us, and we can calculate the WARMs for you on an ongoing basis. So suffice to say, as little or as much assistance as you need in calculating your WARMs, we can provide. We have an Excel-based file right here, which walks you through exactly what data you would need to calculate your WARM, and you can actually use our aptly named our WARM estimator tool in Excel to do those segment level WARM calculations and plug in some prepayment assumptions as well. We have some data and some default values to help you along the way when it comes to prepayment assumptions. But if that's just not something that you have, the time, energy, money, or resources for internally, we can certainly help you and do the WARM calculations for you. We can provide a secure environment where you can upload the Aries file and any other loan level data that we need, and then we can go about doing the WARM calculations on an ongoing basis. So once we have those WARM calculations, we plug them here into the tool, and then it's really off and running from a calculation standpoint in taking care of the vast majority of the number crunching for us, kind of from start to finish. And what I mean by all that is, let's pick a guinea pig for today. Let's go with used vehicle loans. Let's say we calculated the average remaining life of all of our used vehicle loans was 3.5 years. As soon as I plug 3.5 in, it takes just about a second, and everything just recalculated on the fly across the board as it pertains to used vehicle loans and CECL. That's something else that you'll notice about our tool. The entire tool lives in an interactive environment, meaning anytime you change any input or assumption anywhere within the tool, the entire model recalculates on the fly within a second or so. So there's a lot of time-saving benefits to that as well. Most likely, or most commonly, is the fact that we see a lot of models out there that are pretty complicated when it comes to the level and the number of inputs and assumptions that go on throughout building a scenario. And you're forced to plug in hundreds of assumptions and then run a scenario, and then you get an output report, and you're trying to figure out, you're shaking your head trying to figure out which assumption did I make that led to this result, right? So you're constantly trying to spend a huge amount of time reverse engineering which of my assumptions were really relevant and moved the needle in my situation, and which ones, didn't, depending upon my situation. That's not an issue, or is never an issue with the way our tool is designed. You change an assumption or an input, everything across the board, all the way through to the CECL reserve for that segment and for the entire portfolio, recalculates on the fly. Saves a huge amount of time in building scenarios and doing a bunch of what if and stress testing from that perspective. Now, let's dig into the details for the used vehicle loans and see exactly what's going on there. If, in our example, we determined the average remaining life was 3.5 years, we know that what CECL is really requiring of us is that we project right now 3.5 years worth of total aggregate losses on that loan portfolio going forward. Again, CECL is losses over the remaining life of the pool. So if we're going to project 3.5 years worth of total losses going forward, our tool, by default at least, takes a symmetrical view of the look back period, meaning we're going to start by looking at a 3.5 year period in your history and analyzing your experience. How did your loan balances change over that 3.5 year period? How many charge-offs did you aggregate? What direction have those charge-offs trended in? And how many recoveries have you had? We take all that historical information to calculate the first big piece of the puzzle for CECL, and that is, what is our credit union's historical lifetime or life of the loan loss rate on this pool? So the answer for this particular credit union for used vehicle loans is 89 basis points lifetime loss rate over a 3.5 year period. Now, obviously, there's a ton of data that goes into that 89 basis points. Because the methodology is pretty straightforward and our approach to it is as well, all of the supporting data that you need to get to those calculations is right here within the tool. So when you click on the historical analysis tab, you'll see a ton of historical balance data, charge-off recovery data for the newer segmentation that we just moved to last quarter in the call reports, as well as the legacy segmentation before we had all those additional buckets for commercial loans that we've got just recently. Now, all this data is preloaded into the system. So the first time that you ever log in, you will see all of this data for your credit union. You don't ever have to plug in this data. But the first thing we're going to analyze are balances. So if we look at the used vehicle loans, we can see historical balances going back in time for your credit union. We can go back in time further than we need to from a CECL perspective. And we see that over the last 3.5 years, which we've shaded or highlighted in blue just to make it visually more followable, is we average about 233 million. Again, it's a larger credit union, 233 million in used vehicle loans over that 3.5 year period. Now I'm going to come down here and we're going to look at some of the the charge-off and recovery data. We see for used vehicle loans, we see how we've aggregated charge-offs over the last 3.5 years. How our recoveries have trended over that same time, and then our net charge-off and net charge-off ratios. This is all, again, with the legacy or older segmentation, meaning if you remember, up until before March 31st of this year, charge-offs, recoveries, and past dues were only gathered on an additive basis for these 10 buckets, pretty much. All these other buckets were what they called memo items, which we could get charge-off and recovery data for, but we couldn't get it in an additive way. All the balance, all the charge-offs and recoveries for indirect participation, residential construction, including commercial purpose, all that stuff was also in these buckets as well. So they weren't discrete or additive, which made it extremely challenging to get good granular segment level data. In the first quarter of this year, as you know, there were massive changes to the call reports, which changed completely how many buckets we had that we could track charge-offs, recoveries, and past dues for on a completely discrete additive basis. So this is the newer segmentation where we can see charge-offs and recoveries and net charge-offs, as you can see, just starting at March 31st of this year on all these completely discrete, so 20 completely separate and additive buckets. All the non-commercial ones that have mostly pretty much been there, except the fact that unsecured loans, we have all other, and we have non-real estate and real estate. So there's 2 or 3 different kind of quote catch-all buckets where there used to be just one catch-all bucket for the non-commercial loans. And then on the commercial side, we have a lot more detail than we used to have, which is great. So again, we take all this historical data, we calculate lifetime loss rates using the new segmentation, and that feeds right into here on the summary tab. Now, once we have that, that's kind of the first half of the battle. We haven't yet looked outside your 4 walls. We haven't considered environmental data. We haven't considered projecting anything going forward. We just looked at your historical experience. But that's the starting point, right? We have to assume you're going to perform in the future like you have in the past, except for the specific reasons you think things might be different. Those are collectively our Q factors, right? all those qualitative factor adjustments, which represent all the reasons we think conditions, current and future conditions, might be different from what we've seen in the past. Now, this is where the peer data becomes such a great additive value add part of the tool. And so if I click on the Q factors tab here, this is where we're going to manage all of our different qualitative factor adjustments. So we can see what our historical lifetime loss rate is. And then these are all the pluses and minuses, so to speak, where we're modifying that historical rate for our expectation going forward. We have kind of hard-coded columns right now for making an adjustment based upon external or environmental factors like peer experience and economic adjustments. And then here you have sort of an open-ended area where you can add other qualitative factor adjustments as well, any ones that you see fit. You can pick and choose from those 9 suggested ones that have been part of our interagency guidance in our current methodologies for loan loss reporting, right? Qualitative factors as a concept are not new. We've been dealing with them, for as long as I can remember. And there's lots of suggested qualitative factor adjustments that credit unions should consider. Are they all going to apply for every segment of your portfolio? Certainly not. But you can add in, changes in underwriting standards, changes in, mix, changes in experience in your lending staff, acquisitions that you might have taken on, other loan portfolios that you're focused upon growing. So all these other internal qualitative factor adjustments that you're probably already calculating and dealing with can be tweaked in order to play a similar role from a CECL standpoint. And this is where right here we can make an adjustment based upon the peer experience. This is the part that's going to be so helpful, particularly in segments of our portfolio where we have a goose egg, right? Going back to the summary here, we see, over extended periods of time, this credit union just had, no losses in certain segments of the portfolio, but now they can go and say, well, what if I did this analysis that I did on my credit union, this historical kind of analysis where I followed charge-offs and recoveries over time in all these different discrete segments. If I did that entire analysis on every single other credit union in my peer group simultaneously in the background, so if I just crunched gazillions of numbers, what would the environment look like? What would the peer trends look like? And that's exactly what we've done here. So if you were to aggregate your peers' loss experience over the same time frames that we're looking at yours, and we did it for all the same buckets, right? All the same segments of your portfolio. So apples to apples, historical look back period, apples to apples segmentation. We can get kind of a perfect reflection of what the market looks like for that for losses in that segment, regardless of whether we happen to have any losses there or not. So these are weighted averages for all the credit unions in the peer group. Now, when I say your peer group, what am I referring to? So if you're going to use external data like peer data in this type of a tool and calculation, you're gonna wanna get buy-in from your auditors and examiners. So the first place we go to look at peer data is the NCUA itself, right? How does the NCUA group credit unions together to look at relative and compare and contrast relative performance? Well, they are pretty simple. The NCUA has 6 peer groups defined by asset size. Peer group 1 are the smallest credit unions, all the guys under 2 million in total assets, all the way up to peer group 6, which are the largest credit unions, those over $500 million in assets. And so we start there by putting you within your asset-based peer group based upon the NCUA's definition. But then we allow you to also zoom in and out geographically. So if you only wanted to consider, let's say, 100 to $500 million credit unions in the state of Wisconsin, or just in that region of the country, you can choose state-based, regional-based, or national-based asset-based peer groups. So and you can also change peer group size as well. What if you're $510 million in total assets, right? The NCUA sticks you in peer group 6, which is everybody 500 million and above, which means that you're being compared to $20 billion credit unions as a $510 million credit union. probably not where you want to be. So you can kind of jump down one bucket and say, hey, what if I were to look at the 100 to $500 million credit unions? I'm a lot closer in average size to those than I am the gigantic ones. You can kind of roll up and down in asset class as well as in geographic. So if I clicked on peer group 4, it spins for a few seconds and it is recalculating. In that couple seconds, it pulled hundreds of thousands, if not more, of all new call report data. And now we're looking at average loss trends by segment for all the, I guess this would be $50 to $100 million credit unions in the state of Wisconsin. But once you have all this data, what we can do is we can calculate lifetime loss rates for your peer group. Now, obviously, we don't know what your peers' lifetimes are for their WARM calculations, but we apply your WARM calculations to it. So we said, over the same 2-year period, our peers, have aggregated 30 basis points in losses, and we've only aggregated 10. And so you can come into, the Q factor section and say, hey, we've had some pretty good luck. We've had almost no losses in this segment over an extended period of time. Our peers are a little bit higher. So we're going to make a slight adjustment, a qualitative factor adjustment here to bring our future expectations of losses a little bit closer or in the direction of where our peers have been. Maybe just because, you feel that you'll continue to outperform the peer group, but you want to trend in that direction. So this is where you would, you get the data that you need to justify those assumptions. And something that's a best practice that we highly recommend, and we build areas for it all within the tool, is the ability to take notes and do it at the segment level. So for example, we hear this day in, day out from all of the auditors that we work with is document, document, document. It's probably more important to them to know how you came up with your 20 basis point net adjustment than the fact that it was 20 basis points versus 30 or 40 basis points. You need to make reasonable assumptions throughout the tool, throughout your analysis of CECL, and you need to document what they were and why they were reasonable. So, keeping track of all those assumptions that you made, where you made them and why you made them and what your supporting evidence was can be kind of tricky depending upon what methodology and model you're using. Our tool simplifies it significantly. Right where you make an adjustment, you make a note, you start building your narrative as to why you made the adjustments that you did right here. And not only will it help you in the exam process and the auditing process, and whenever you save the tool, create a new scenario, export it, all those notes get attached to those segments and presented to whoever's looking at the report so they can follow exactly what your thought process was. It also helps you next month, next quarter, when you come back in to update your CECL calculations, you'll see exactly, what your thought process was last quarter when you made these assumptions and whether anything's changed environmentally, economically, to cause you to want to change those assumptions. So you get out of this from a defense standpoint exactly what you put into it. So we highly suggest making some good diligent note taking there. And so you make all the qualitative factor adjustments you want. The tool adds them all up and comes up with a net adjustment, and that's what carries back over to the summary tab. Once we have all of our Q factor adjustments, we've arrived pretty much at our expected future lifetime loss rate. Simply historical experience plus or minus the sum total of all of our changes equals our expected future experience. Once we have that, we need to apply that to the current and proper loan population or pool population. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, current is the first part. And obviously, we're only getting your data publicly on a quarterly basis. So by default, these current balances will be coming from your most recently filed call report. If you file your call report early within the quarter, like if let's say you filed it 2 weeks ago, as soon as you file your call reports, these balances are updating for you. As soon as the end of this month, it's going to be the end of this week or the beginning of next week. Once everybody's finished filing, then all the peer data gets updated for the next quarter. But you want to make sure these balances are current and updated. Again, just because we're only getting public data once a quarter doesn't limit how often you run this tool or when you run it as of. At any given point in time, you can come in here and override these quarter end balances with last month's or yesterday's GL balances. And then your CECL calculation will be as of whatever point in time you plugged in those overrided values. Now, this is also where we would modify or adjust our current balance if we had any loan populations we wanted to exclude completely from a CECL analysis, which would be if you had any PPP loans on the books, right, that have no potential for loss. If you had a sizable government guaranteed portion of SBA program loans, for example, any loan balances where there's no risk of loss or are simply outside the scope of CECL, like some loans held on the books for sale at fair market value, we're going to want to subtract those out here. This is also where you'd probably want to net out if you had significant balances of fully share secured loans, right? We don't want to attach an expected future loss rate to a loan balance where if there were a loss, it wouldn't be coming out of your reserve. Doesn't make sense intuitively to do that. So let's say we came in here and we had, all other unsecured loans. Let's say we had some fully share secured loans in here. If we had $1 million worth, I'd come in, I'd subtract $1 million from the current balance, and I'd make a note of it, right? Note that we netted out 1 million fully share secured. So again, lots of places to take notes on any adjustments that you've made and reasoning for it. Once we've made those adjustments, the last thing we need to keep track of or manage differently or separately is our individually assessed loans. So if we have any individual loans that, where default is imminent and there's a significant issue with the loan where you expect a loss and you have a reasonable assumption of what that loss might be, those are the loans where we still need to cull them from the herd. The old guidance for when we need to individually assess loans, the FAS 5 versus the FAS 114, well, they're gone, or they will be gone at the beginning of next year and replaced by CECL. So the old standard of when exactly a loan is impaired, and if a loan is a TDR, right, a restructured loan, the TDRs are also going the way of the dodo under CECL next year. So we have a lot less guidance, at least right now. I'm sure we're going to get a lot over the next 6 months additional, but right now there's not a great amount of guidance out there as to when loans need to be split out from the bucket, right, from the collectively assessed pool, which should be 99% of your loans, and then dealt with on an individual basis. We're not here to tell you what that threshold is because it hasn't really been well defined yet. We'll get more data as that comes out. But what we have done is provided a place for you to build in the individually assessed loans and any reserves you want to set aside specifically for them right here within the tool. Once you plug that data in, it feeds right through to the summary and pulls out those balances. So we're not double counting them, right? Let's say of your 250 million in used vehicle loans, you've got 900,000 that are individually assessed. So we split that out of the pool, and then we do our final CECL calculation on the pool balance. And then down here, we build back in, we add back in the reserve for the individually assessed loans. That's sort of, well, a couple of things to point out, but that's the main idea of how the tool works on a step-by-step basis. We have a module here for held to maturity securities, which we just added in the last couple of weeks. It's not something we tackled early on in the process because it's just not a very big piece of the puzzle or a piece of the puzzle at all for the majority of credit unions that we see. CECL does have to apply to your securities portfolio as well, but it's typically just held to maturity securities. So just financial instruments that are carried at amortized costs, which would typically not include available for sale available for sale securities that are held on the books at fair market value. And the majority of held to maturity securities that you have, if you have any, are typically in government guaranteed or sponsored vehicles, which have negligible risk of actual credit loss. Keep in mind, there's different types of credit loss. We're not talking about market risk here. We're talking about credit risk. So as you can see, this credit union in Wisconsin is pretty big. They have $500 million in securities. 100% of that is classified as available for sale. So they don't have to worry about this module for held to maturity because they simply don't have any. But moving forward, the last thing that you have to take into account is also unfunded commitments. Again, another very small overall piece of the puzzle for CECL, but not irrelevant for some credit unions. So we wanted to provide a methodology here for estimating, and what you're doing is pretty hypothetical, right, for the unfunded commitments, because honestly, what they're asking you to do here is project potential long-term losses on loans that don't exist yet, right? So we have to jump through some mental hoops here in order to come to an estimate, but we've kind of walked you through the steps as to how to do that. And you can follow these steps and some of the default assumptions that we built in here to help you along your way. Once you've taken all that into account, we calculate what your total reserve is under CECL, we compare it to your current reserve, and we see exactly what the surplus or shortfall is as of that point in time, whatever point in time where you plug in those current loan balances. So that's how the tool works step by step. As far as managing scenarios, once you have everything exactly the way you want it, you go ahead and save it as a new scenario, give it a name, give it a date. And as soon as you save it, then it's securely saved on our servers. You can access it anytime you want to. You can have as many people accessing the tool as you'd like. As I think Jason mentioned, there's no additional seat licenses or anything for additional users. So you can have as many users at the credit union as you like utilizing the tool. And you can create as many scenarios as you'd like. This drop-down box of scenarios would go on forever if you'd like it to. So each time you come in here, month after month or quarter after quarter, this should really become a repository of all your saved CECL analyses at different times, so that you can track and trace exactly what is changing and how and when it's changing as we move through this year and this economy and into a CECL world next year. As far as exporting the tool is concerned, obviously when it's time to send it to an auditor or an examiner, you're not going to want to give them full access to the interactive tool to play around with the scenarios you've built, but you have full control when you export it of exactly how much or how little of a tool that you do export. If you're giving a quarterly board summary, you're probably just going to want the summary results. Whereas if you're sending it to an auditor, I'm sure they're going to want all the nitty gritty. So you can include economic trends, you can include the securities, the unfunded commitments, all the CECL charts, and you can do it in a PDF environment, or you can actually export the entire tool into an Excel environment. So you can add additional rows, columns, additional math, and additional notes where you see fit. Something I just realized, Jason, that I had sort of overlooked, in the Q Factors tab, where we're modifying all of our historical loss rates for how the future might be different, you can click through your portfolio and get these visual summaries of kind of all the most important elements in CECL in one chart. So if I click on, first mortgages, right, first liens, I can see, our credit union's long-term trend of losses, that's the blue bars. The peer group's long-term trend of losses, that's the green lines. The shaded gray area is the look-back period that we're using, that's an assumption, of course, for that particular segment, so we can get a visual idea of what historical time frame that we're looking at to start estimating losses. And then the orange line is your total CECL estimate for that segment based upon all the inputs that you have so far. If I were to change the Q factors, if I jacked up the Q factors here, watch what happens. Whoop, the CECL estimate popped way back up there. So this is a great kind of visual summary of everything going on, and you can click through the portfolio and get an idea of exactly what that looks like. Here's where you can also overlay some economic trends as well, anything from national or state unemployment to prime rates to inflation expectations and some others as well. We're constantly kind of adding to and looking for ways to add some more demographic and economic trends that you can overlay over your loss history. That's an area where we're going to continue to enhance the tool over the next few months or so. But I think at this point, let me point to the other resources. So we have a user guide that's updated frequently. It's a visual user guide. It walks you through each step of the tool and how to utilize it. So Jason does not allow me to give quizzes at the end of the webinars anymore. So we make sure we've got a good functional user guide there, a methodology guide, and a white paper. Here's a draft of an implementation letter that we provide for everybody. It's kind of a Word document template which gives you some language to use not only in sharing with your auditors and examiners, from an implementation standpoint, but also some helpful policy language as you start redrafting policies to reflect CECL. Here's another link to that Excel-based WARM estimator tool. Again, you can utilize that as much or as little as you see fit, depending upon how much help you need with the WARMs. So feel free to give us a call so we can talk through that with you. And then the results of our recent SOC 1 audit that we did on the tool, if it's something you need for your due diligence process in utilizing us as a vendor. And then here are just some of the better presentations we've seen from the various regulatory and FASB bodies as it pertains not just to CECL in general, but to the weighted average remaining maturity and its appropriateness for community-based institutions. At this point, I think that's everything I wanted to point out here. I'm gonna turn it back over, the sharing back over to Jason. I made sure that we included a handful of slides that kind of summarize how the tool works. I realized this was done interactively online, and if you're gonna print out a PDF of the presentation that we're gonna send to everybody after the call, you might wanna have some of those in there. So I'm just gonna briefly point out some of those slides and then let Jason go ahead and wrap up for us. So this is just kind of a summary slide here, which reminds you of some of the most important elements and features of the CECL tool. And then this is sort of just managing the tool, right? Managing the as of date, managing your scenarios and your exporting, managing your note taking and justification and narratives around the assumptions that you put into it. The next couple slides. This is just some additional data that we've, since we are now certainly very much in the business of aggregating call report data from every credit union in the country, we thought that would, our users asked us if we could share some different type of financial data, not just credit loss data, but also just some performance and other types of financial data, both on your credit union and pretty much every credit union in the country. So it's free for all credit unions that are subscribing to our CECL tool. You'll have the ability to go and look at mapping data and financial data over different timeframes historically for any credit unions in the country, and also this is kind of a filtering tool on this page where you can, if you're curious who's in your NCUA peer group, right? If you're in California and you're 250 million in assets, and you want to know that peer data on your CECL tool is utilizing $1 to $500 million credit unions in the state, who's in that bucket? Then you can come right here, you can organize this by state, you can sort it by assets, and you can see exactly who is in your NCUA peer group and what their performance looks like. So this is a great little tool to kind of do some filtering and sorting and peer group comparison. These are just some background reference slides, just reminding everybody it was such a big, huge shift in the NCUA's data gathering process at March 31st to the changes in the call report. Pretty much 85% of all asset quality type data in the call reports was completely revamped in the at March 31st. So I think credit unions get confused by this a lot because they see the segments that we have on the tool and they say, well, those segments aren't new. We've always had balances on the call reports for all of those different types of segments, even if they were memo items. That's true. We've always had balance data. What we haven't had is charge off, recovery, 30 to 89 days past due, et cetera, on all those other segments in a additive, right, additive discrete way. So if you go to the next slide, Jason, you'll see that on the left were the 9 additive segments of call report of charge-offs and recoveries for the last 30 years on the call report. Starting in March 31st, the new is on the right, where there's now 20 segments of data where there were 9 that are additive. So a lot of completely new data. All the red you see here are all brand new field IDs on the call report that just started on March 31st. I know I'm speaking to the choir here collectively. You guys are all very well aware of this because you're the ones that had to fill all these new fields out. But it was a seismic shift in asset quality data that that we had to make sure we built into the tool, and we did. This is just an upcoming enhancement. We had gotten suggestions from a lot of credit unions that, hey, instead of us, manually adding these additional columns in our Q factors tab and starting to type in these different adjustments, we've always been making Q factor adjustments based upon this interagency guidance that's been around for a long time. Is there any way you guys could just add all those columns in like by default, and then we don't have to do it ourselves? And if we don't want to use one, we can always delete it. So we said, sure. So that's something that hopefully will be available in the next few weeks here. If you go to the next slide, I think I did sort of a draft idea of it. So this looks a little different from our current Q factors tab because you have all these kind of pre-built, pre-default columns. Again, if you have no adjustments for portfolio mix or for problem loan trends or loan review system, you can delete that column entirely or just apply it to a specific segment of the portfolio. But we wanted to give you kind of more guidance as opposed to less guidance on a Q factor standpoint. So that's something that'll be in the tool in the next few weeks. At this point, Jason, why don't you go ahead and finish this up?
Yeah, so thanks, Steve. That was fantastic.
Sure.
So we will, certainly, back to the question of that warm figure. I think we have close to 300 credit unions that are using the CECLSolver now in parallel, of which about a quarter to a third cannot just directly get the warm from the core ALM provider. So again, we're here to help if you need that. This is just some of the data we need. So start thinking about that, right? What we need is current balance, and then the maturity date on each of your loans that have a maturity date. And then, we need to be able to separate those into their, new car, used car, the appropriate bucket. So think about that, like Steve was saying before, getting durations is something that you're going to have to do pretty much for any tool that you end up going with. So definitely something to start thinking about, looking for this data now. For the most part, it's been pretty straightforward when we, talk to the cores or, help our members kind of get this data. But there's certainly some that, it can be a real headache. So start to think about this now. That way, by the time you come on board, that we can certainly help. And that kind of is one of the next questions, right, that we always get on these is how much? Well, it's all asset based. We wanted this tool to work for everyone, no matter how small or big you were. So really reach out to us. Let me pull up the email here, info@quickrate.com. Shoot us a quick email. Say, hey, I'd love to schedule a time, and either me or David, the other sales gentleman for credit unions, will reach out to get that scheduled. The best part is, too, is, we've already collected this data. We can get a good indication of what your reserve's going to look like now heading into CECL. And that's really kind of, I think, kept a lot of people up at night, is wondering what that number is really going to look like. And we can at least get a good idea of what you're, based on your historic losses, about where you'll be heading into CECL. So definitely reach out and go through everything, look at the numbers, discuss pricing and all that. So I didn't have any other questions. Steve, anything else?
No, I think that's it for me today, unless there's any questions from the group.
Not real quiet today, nothing there. So fantastic, everyone. Thank you all again for joining us. Give us a caller. Let's get a tour or demo scheduled and get Cecil checked off your list of things to do in 22. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.